In this lesson on quarantine configuration in Security Gateway, we're going to talk about the following topics. What to do with quarantined messages, such as whether to hold them on the server or allow the mail server to filter out quarantined messages. Global and per domain settings. User permissions, including whether to allow users to view and manage their own quarantine folders or to allow users to manage their own quarantine settings. We'll show an example of the user quarantine, including the message listing with options to release messages from the quarantine, delete them, or mark them as spam or non-spam. And then we'll discuss the administrative quarantine and the administrative quarantine summary email message that can be sent to administrators at regular intervals. In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to configure the quarantine settings in Security Gateway. Now, you may recall that throughout various other security features, you have options that you can select to send messages to the quarantine. For example, if I click on the anti-spam section here and I go to heuristics and Bayesian, you can select various options throughout Security Gateway to quarantine messages that meet certain criteria. For example, messages that scored above a certain threshold, for example. Other examples are located throughout Security Gateway, such as right here for the DNS blacklist screen. You have an option to quarantine the message if the sending server is on a blacklist. And likewise, you'll find similar quarantine options throughout many of the other security features. So in this lesson, I'm going to talk about how to configure the quarantine settings in Security Gateway. So you'll find those settings under the Setup Users menu here. And under Mail Configuration, Quarantine Configuration is located right here. And in Security Gateway, you have the option of holding quarantined messages on the server, or optionally allowing them to be delivered, but then optionally tagging the message subject with a tag or a series of characters. And I'll go into these in a little bit more detail. Notice, by the way, that these settings can be configured globally or on a per domain basis, just like with many of the other settings in Security Gateway. Now, before I go into detail on all these settings, keep in mind there are two quarantines. There's the user quarantine, which these settings apply to here. And then there's the administrative quarantine, which these settings toward the bottom of this screen apply to. The administrative quarantine is used for messages that might contain sensitive data, such as messages that are triggered by the data leak prevention feature, or messages that might contain questionable content that is more suitable for administrative review as opposed to letting the users review it. So let's go back to the top and I'll explain these settings here. So enabling this option here allows you to hold quarantine messages on the Security Gateway server. And then using these options below, you can determine whether and how often to send users an email listing the contents of their quarantine. So for example, every hour, every 24 hours, or 12 hours, every day, every week, and so forth. And then quarantine emails can be sorted by the date they were received or other criteria such as the from, the subject, or the message score. Now this checkbox here, when enabled, will allow users to click on a blacklist option in the quarantine summary email that they will receive, or in their quarantine listing in the Security Gateway interface if they've been granted access to view their own quarantine. The other option is to choose Allow the mail server or client to filter quarantine messages rather than holding them on the server. When you enable this option, you can then tag the subject with a series of characters and then optionally add a specific header to the message, such as the X spam flag header, and then configure the mail server to filter based on the contents of either the subject or the spam flag header. So you would configure the content filter on the mail server for that. So if we do hold the messages on the server, the quarantine messages on the server, and send a an email listing the contents of user quarantines to each user, then they will receive a quarantine summary email. And that summary email will look like this. So here's a Security Gateway quarantine summary for a user. We'll open it. And this is what the user receives, their personal spam quarantine report with the listing of all the message in their quarantine. The user can then release the message from the quarantine, always allow, which will whitelist the sender, or confirm as spam, which will mark the message as spam and it will be removed from the quarantine, or blacklist the sender. So, for example, if I click the blacklist button, the user will get a confirmation that looks like this. If you click the release option, the message will be released from quarantine and delivered to the inbox. Now let's go back into Security Gateway as an administrator, and then we'll discuss the other options available on this screen. The Users section right here allows you to specify what users can and cannot do with their quarantine. For example, whether or not they can view and manage their own quarantine folders or modify their own quarantine settings. Right now I have both of these options selected, so let me give you an example by logging in as an end user, and I'll show you what they see depending on whether these two options are enabled or disabled. So here is a user who is logged in, and on this account I'm going to the settings menu, and notice this user can specify whether or not they want to use the default quarantine settings for their domain or specify their own quarantine settings. All of these settings can be disabled so that the user does not have access to all of these features. The user can also access their quarantine using the link here under View My Quarantine, with all of their quarantine messages with options to release the message from quarantine, delete the message, mark the message as spam or not spam. So if I go back into Security Gateway as an administrator, and I uncheck these boxes to allow the users to view and manage their quarantine folders or to allow them to modify their own quarantine settings, and then I click on Save, the user, and all I'll need to do here is refresh my screen to show you the difference. There's no more View My Quarantine, and under the My Account section under Settings, there are no longer any options for the user to manage their own quarantine settings. So the change is instantaneous. So now let's go back to Security Gateway as an administrator, and we'll explain the remaining features on this screen. So with the administrative quarantine, again, these are messages that might have been triggered by a data leak prevention rule or that might have contained questionable content that requires administrative review. And it works very similarly to the section above where you can determine how often the administrator receives an email listing the contents of the administrative quarantine. And also you have various sorting options, just like we did with the user quarantine. And now I'm going to show you an example of what the administrative quarantine email, summary email looks like. So this is the administrative quarantine summary email that the administrator receives at regular intervals, with a listing of all the messages held in the quarantine, and then an option on the right-hand side to release the message from the quarantine. Now notice whether you're an end user or an administrator, in these quarantine summary emails there's a link to log in to the Security Gateway interface to view that information on in Security Gateway. And if you've configured settings for a specific domain, those settings, or those exceptions as they are called, will be listed down here at the bottom of the screen.